And
Hello and welcome to World Sand Project. I'm Shelley Carney.
you know, there's something about that calypso music that just wants to make you dance, no?
That's right.
It's very dancey. Hey, guys, and I'm Toby Younis. Shelley and I are your hosts today. And in today's show, we're going to look at a sample from, as Shelley says, LePage Park at the confluence of the John Day and Columbia Rivers in Oregon/Washington, on the border of Oregon/Washington. It should be fun. Very different from some of the samples we looked at in the past. Hey, thanks for joining us today. How are you doing, Michelle?
Super.
Super duper. And as you know, we have two more shows today. We have Shelley Carney's The Softer Side at 4 p.m. on her channel, thesofterside.live.
That's right.
Correct. And then at 7 o'clock, we've got A Gypsy's Kiss, and you can find us there at agypsyskiss.tv. So thanks for joining us for all three programs. It should be a fun day for us. So the sample that we're going to be talking about today came from our friend Lisa Smith. Now, you might be aware that Lisa sent us a sample. She actually sent us two samples at the same time. The last sample was from the Washington side of the Columbia River. This one is from the Oregon side. It's further upstream by about a mile and a half from where she sent us the last sample. And it actually comes from a park that is maintained and managed by the Corps of Engineers, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And that's because not far from it is a dam that's managed and administered by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So we're going to take a look at that today. But I do want to mention our mission. Our mission is to make the public aware that we are experiencing an unparalleled use of sand, and that sand is as limited a resource as air and water. And yes, there is a chance we could run out. And the reason that's so important is because we use sand in construction, and we use sand in reclamation, and we're using it at a very high rate of speed. So keep that in mind as you're watching all of this beautiful work that we find under the microscope, and we hope that you enjoy it. And again, keep that in mind.
Okay.
Sand wars. Mm-hmm. Okay, let me switch over to the full screen shot.
So I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you said that we can't use the desert sand for construction, but can you use it for building islands, adding on to islands?
No, it has the same effect. It even has a worse effect.
Oh, it washes away too easily? Or
yeah,
what?
if you look at, for example, occasionally you'll run into quicksand. Quicksand is usually desert sand combined with water, liquefaction. And the reason is that sand is like little ball bearings. It's shaped like little ball bearings, effectively. So it doesn't grip. Some of the sand that you're going to see today, you'll see the difference, and you'll see why it makes such good sand, because most of the sand that we're going to look at today looks like miniature igneous rocks that you were to pick up. Do I have a sample here? I don't have an igneous rock here. But they've got very sharp edges. And that's what makes the best sand for construction or for land reclamation, like they've done in Dubai and like Singapore has done. They take river sand, basically, in order to do it, because that river sand has the fine grains, but they're rough hewn, I guess is the best way to describe it. So they interlock. Desert sand just doesn't do that, which is why, of course, when Dubai built its Palm Island, it didn't use its own sand. It's on the border of one of the biggest sand areas, with deserts in the world, and it couldn't use it for reclamation. So, unfortunately, they've got to pull this kind of the sand that we're going to be looking at today. Although, as I said, the sand that we're going to be looking at today is very different. So let's pop open the window, and here's the data on it. I have posted this link in the. Did I do that? I will put, if it's not there already, I will post this link in the description box below so you can get to these photos. So this is our World Sand Project sample number 9 at LePage Park, and I'm going to tell you a story about LePage Park at the confluence of the John Day and Columbia Rivers near Wasco, Oregon, in the United States of America, and of course that's the geographic coordinates. So let me show you the overview map. This is what the area looks like, and we're looking at this area right here. There's a park, that's LePage Park, and this entire area here is administered, and a lot of the Columbia River is administered by the United States Army Corps of Engineers because there's so many dams on it. Now, dams are a problem for sand production because the sand backs up. And as a matter of fact, what they have to do is they have to dredge out the sand from behind the dam and do something else with it. Fortunately, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is wise enough to take the sand that they dredge and put it someplace where it can be used for other purposes, including beach rebuilding along the Pacific coast. So, was that me or you?
You.
No, let me turn that off. Okay, so as you can see, the areas that very similar. It looks like a more dry area than you would think the Pacific Northwest would look like, but the Pacific Northwest is actually gets much greener further down river. So this is LePage Park. And again, it's a nice little park along the John Day River, but there's an interesting history behind it. So this is one of the rivers that Lewis and Clark, the famous explorers, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, explored on behalf of Thomas Jefferson in order to reclaim the Louisiana Purchase, the purchase they made from France. And they started at the point at which the Missouri River joins the Mississippi, and they headed towards the northwest, looking for what was believed to be the Northwest Passage. And the only information they had was that had been derived from trappers and some of the Native American tribes along the way. Well, in North Dakota, in a location they called the Fort Mandan, which it was named after a tribe that was in that area, which is now gone. That tribe no longer exists, the Mandans. They met a trapper whose name was Jean-Baptiste LePage, and he traveled the rest of the way with the Lewis and Clark operation all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So when they got to this point, and I'll show you a map that actually comes from Clark's notebooks, where they named the river that is now named the John Day River, they named it the LePage River. His name is French, of course, Jean-Baptiste LePage. And they named this river after him. Later on, folks in Oregon, before it actually became a state, renamed it the John Day River after another trapper who had a really interesting life. And the most interesting thing I discovered about John Day is that he was declared dead on 3 different occasions in 3 different states. And he would always just oh no, I'm in actually, Washington or wherever. He was always someplace else, but he was declared dead. But when the Army Corps of Engineers built this, and as I understand it, they built it on reclaimed land. They had to reclaim some of the land by dredging some of the river and incorporating it into the park. And Lisa Smith visited the park when she collected this sample for us. There's the bridge that goes across the John Day River. If you look at the previous picture, you'll see that the John Day is relatively small in comparison to the Columbia, but the Columbia is a big river. You can actually boat on the John Day, and there are, as you can see, piers. Boat on the John Day River, and you can see piers there. And I'm just going to go with the colloquial LePage Park rather than the French LePage, although it does sound cool, Jean-Baptiste LePage. So this is a drone shot of the park. It looks like a very nice park, and as you can see, they do launch boats here either for the John Day, because it is both wide and deep enough, or for the Columbia, which is eminently wide and deep enough. But of course, just downriver a couple of miles, you're going to bump into that dam, and I've got a picture of that as well. So this is looking upriver, up the John Day from the hill that overlooks the park towards their camping area. They have a RV, I wouldn't say camping area, an RV and a picnic area. It's a very nice, it looks like it's a very well-maintained park, as it is maintained by the Army Corps of Engineers or probably a contractor. That's the bridge that goes across the John Day and at the point at which the John Day meets the Columbia. Other pictures of the park. And that's the dam. That is the John Day Dam. So they named the dam after John Day and the park after LePage. And as you can see, it's a pretty good sized dam. Over on this side are salmon runs because the salmons do run up this river. So they've been very careful to maintain the value of the Columbia in salmon spawning, in this particular area. So that's what those are for. You can see in comparison the size of some of the fishing boats that are below the dam, but there are several like these on the Columbia, all under the auspices. Now I'm going to see if I can. Let me see if I can grow this bigger. Don't I have a? I guess I don't. But this is actually a page from William, let's see, it was Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. So this is a page from Clark's notes, and these are his drawings of the Columbia River, and this is the point at which what we now call the John Day River meets the Columbia, and as you can see, he called it after Jean-Baptiste, he called it the River LePage or LePage. It was later that other settlers in the area renamed it the John Day River. So let's take a look at our samples. Now this sample that Lisa collected was smaller than the other one, so I didn't fill a complete sample jar with it. And let me see if I got a size, so you can get a sense of the size that I'm going to go back to full frame for just a second. So this is the size of our sample jar. And I didn't actually, tell Lisa or anyone else what size to collect, but she collected a smaller sample. Not that it worries, it's plenty enough to put it under the microscope. So that sample, I also screened it. I also put the sample through the 2mm screen and some of the larger, greater than 2mm. Now they look to me like, sand. There's a point at which this would have to be called according to science, pebbles, because they are larger than the 2mm that are sand. We're going to take a look at both of them under the microscope. So that's what they look like. This is the sand that fell through the screen. This is the sand that remained in the screen. And we're going to look at both of them under the microscope. Now, I did run this through the magnet as I have the other samples. And as you can see, first of all, the first thing that you see is that the sand granules actually look like igneous rocks. They don't look like the sand samples that we've seen before where they are primarily a single mineral, right? So these are definitely look more like igneous rocks that are made up of multiple minerals. And if we get a chance, I did find, as I was looking at this sample under the polarizing microscope, that when there's a dent in the rock like this right here, like this one right there, there's actually microscopic gemstones in those breaks in the rock. But as you can, these are the smaller of the sand samples. These went through the 2mm screen, but they look like igneous rocks, and they must contain a great deal of iron because they pretty well stuck to that magnet. And as you can see, the magnet didn't pick up any, quote, iron filings or magnetite. These are just the rocks that had a heavy concentration of iron that were attracted to the magnet. This is a wide-angle view of the smaller of the two, the sand sample. And as you can see, there is a variety, but they are dominated by the blue-gray colored igneous rocks. We do have some quartz there. And I brought these along. These are actually some samples that Shelley had and had collected while we were out on some of our travels. Let me go back to full frame so you can get a sense of what this is. So this is basically a quartz rock, and you can see it's not completely translucent, but it has all the features of a quartz rock. This is a quartz crystal, and that grows naturally. Now, people will take those crystals and turn them into pendants and things like that. And then here is a sample of quartz that has been tumbled by a rock hound of some kind, right? They've put it in the tumbler. Now, quartz is relatively hard, and that's why it lasts. That's why it makes it all the way down from the tops of mountains down onto beaches, because it's very durable. So it takes longer to tumble and get this quality of smoothness to it. But what we see right here, those are actually...
I can't see that.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me, thank you for telling me. So these right here, the white ones, are actually quartz. And there are some that are translucent, but for the most part, they're white quartz. But again, you can see the sample is dominated by these gray, blue, what look to me like igneous rocks. There's a bit of olivine up here, but for the most part, it's gray, blue with the occasional one that has additional minerals in it, but they look more like igneous rocks than they do, the sand crystals that we've seen in the past. So this is a close-up view of it. We're going to see more of this under the microscope. And what I was telling Shelley earlier, if you look at these rocks, they're all very young because they're very rough edged. They don't see the refinement that we see on some of the beach sand that we've seen where they've been tumbled by nature long enough to get smooth. These are very, very relatively young rocks, and that there's a lot of edges. And it's those edges that gives them the ability to kind of merge together, and work in concrete and in land reclamation. That's why it's so important. So this is a close-up of the over 2 millimeters. But again, they're kind of the same construct. They look more like igneous rocks. It would be hard to believe if you were to show this picture to a person. It would be hard for them to believe that they were looking at sand rather than, say, the rocks in your garden outside, the cobble in your garden outside. And this is an even closer look. That's definitely more quartz. This is quartz-ish. But again, these all look like they're just miniature igneous rocks with a variety of minerals in them, like most igneous rocks. So let's go over to the...
question
yeah.
from Corey Jacobs. Is the milk coloring due to bubbles or something? Why are some like glass?
Some like glass are they're polished, and they're older, right? The older they are, the more refined they get. And it's also a matter of how they're created. So in order to get that glassy looking, igneous rocks, as you know, are their original source of igneous rocks are either magma, which makes them intrusive, or lava, which makes them extrusive. And the longer they take to cool, the longer that quartz refines. And that's when it gets more compressed and hotter, and it gets more crystalline, more clear, more translucent. The shorter it takes to cool, then they end up looking more like the ones you see right here, more opaque than translucent. So it's all a matter of heat and pressure and the length of time under which that quartz is under heat and pressure. Okay, so let me switch over to the microscope, and what we're going to look at first is the stereo microscope. And we're going to pick that up right here. And what I thought I'd do today is I put a quarter directly under the microscope to give you a sense of what we're looking at in terms of gross magnification. And then when I zoom in, I'll try and get back to the quarter so you can have a sense of it. So let me roll this over to one side. And I've actually put both dishes of the stones, both the 2 millimeter and, as you'll see, I'll slide over here, the over 2 millimeter on the same stage, so that we can look at them and make the comparison. So let's start with the 2 millimeter, and again, you can see a variety, but primarily dominated by what I call those miniature igneous rocks. Let me get that in focus for you. There is, the whites are definitely quartz. Here's one that tends to be more translucent, like Corey was asking about, and these that don't. But then again, you're dominated by these blue-gray. Is Rick in the room?
I don't
Rick
see
might
him.
be able to explain why why those look that way. So let me zoom in. I'm at basically 0.7x right now. I'm going to zoom into 4.5. Give me a second to refocus here, and we'll look around inside those little rocks. There we are. So there's a quartz crystal that's what I'd call semi-translucent. So it's somewhere between the pure translucent that we see in a lot of the sand grains that have worked their way down to the beaches that we've seen and that we're going to see again on Friday, and the completely opaque that look like this. So let's scroll over just a little bit and look at what I think of as these igneous rocks. And there's a perfect example of that. It's got multiple minerals in it, and as you can see, if you didn't know better, that would look like a pebble or a cobble in your garden in the backyard. Because up until this time, what we've seen are primarily single minerals. We see the olivine, and we see a lot of the quartz, and we see the pink quartz. And on Friday, you're going to see red quartz. You're going to see purple quartz, but all single minerals. This one just seems to be made of multiple minerals. And I guess over time, if it were to move off the John Day into the Columbia, through all the dams, and eventually onto the beach, it would break down even further than it is now. But here's another example. Let me show you the one below that, because what I found real interesting is that if you look carefully, what you end up seeing are what I called the micro gemstones. There's little tiny gemstones embedded in the rock itself. And you can see them. You'll see them more definitively underneath the polarized microscope. But, you know, it's really amazing. Let me see if I can get a colored one for you here. Give me just a second. So there's more of the opaque quartz, but it does have other minerals on it. So it, you know, again, what they look like is very young. Now, young is relative, because young in this case could be hundreds of thousands of years rather than millions. There's some more olivine right there, that the green colored one. And let me get, let me zoom back out so I can find, oh, it's right against the edge, so it's going to be hard to, let me see if I can find another one here. There we are. So I think is this the one we already looked at? I had kind of a, so this is kind of the same construct, you know, an igneous rock. Give me a second so I can move it over and up. An igneous rock, but it's collected other minerals. Now, these didn't look like gemstones to me. When we look at them under the polarizing microscope, which is more has more a little bit more magnification, you'll be able to see them because the light reflects off the gemstones differently than it does the pure mineral part of the rock. Not that gemstones aren't minerals, but. So I did find in this sample that little, it's actually a piece of wood. So anytime you see something like that in the sample, it tends to. So here's one that's got gemstones all around it. Over on the one that's pointing over towards the left, those are gemstones. You can see or gems, and I say gemstones, it could be quartz with just colored impurities in it, but citrine and aquamarine, and there's several gemstones that are basically quartz with impurities that colorize them, and that's what you see there. I'm going to scroll over to the larger sample, the rocks from the larger sample, and you'll see a lot of the same things. I didn't see much difference in terms of construct, except that they were, you know, definitely larger. They didn't make it through the screen, if you will. Right. But to me, again, they just look like igneous rocks that have been formed from various minerals along their ride from the top of the mountains downward. And these primarily, I did see a lot of these, the more orange ones that were a little bit bigger, a little bit more. And if you look at these bigger ones, their edges are just a little bit smoother than the ones that we saw earlier. So
Looks like a lemon bar with powdered sugar on
it does, doesn't it? That's what I thought when I first saw it. So let me zoom back out and see if we can find some other things on here. And what I'll do in just a minute, I'll go back, once I zoom in all the way, I'll go back to the quarter to give you a sense of what, we may come back to that one right there, but let me see if there's anything else that's got a little red in it. There it is right there. So as I look at these before I get ready for the show, I start seeing things that are interesting. And I want to share them with you. And here's one.
It's a dark red.
Yeah, it's a very, very dark red.
Well, it was. Now
It is in comparison to the others. I think what happens is the these cameras don't have white balance when they're connected to the computer. You can actually control the white balance if you're making an image or a video from them, but when you're connected to the computer, it does its own white balance, so it creates little funny situations. But that's right next to a quartz. So I'm going to zoom all the way in here and get in focus, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the quarter so you have something to compare with. So let's go in this direction. And we're going to go past sample 1 and get to the quarter. And you can see, all right, so now that's close enough that you can't even tell what's there. But let me raise it up so we can find some of the lettering on the quarter here. You have to travel a long distance to it.
that's the E.
That's the E in
D.
United.
United.
So, all right. So there's your E. That's the magnification. And that's the 4.5x zoom on the E. All right. So let's make, let me go back now. And let's take a look. So that's your sand. That's about the same size as the E on a quarter, it looks like. You know, so that gives you a sense of the how much we're magnifying it. Now I'm going to let me go back to full screen for just a moment, and I'm going to go back. I'm going to go from the stereo microscope to the polarized microscope, and in order to do that, I have to close this one, and then it closes everything, and then I got to plug it in. Just give me a second. At least I don't have to change cameras. These are actually two different microscope cameras. So let me open up and there's an app that runs with them. And I promise this weekend what I will do is I will calibrate them so we can start taking measurements. Okay, so let me switch over to full for window shot. And that's what they look like under the polarized microscope. Now, this is the 5x objective lens. But one of the things that I discovered, so there's a couple of things I discovered. Number one,
It's all gold.
It looks like it's all gold. Yeah, again, I think that's from, that's quartz, right? That's just quartz. But because of the light, it's a halogen lamp. And so since I can't auto adjust out of it, I get a hue. What it gives me here is color, but it only has hue and saturation. So let me at least go to default.
Isn't it hue then?
No, it's color temperature. So let me go back to default and see how it changes it. It makes it whiter. And I did get some glass petri dishes this time, so we're not going to see as much of that background rainbow as we did before. But let me show you something that I found really interesting. Some of these rocks have what I would call some of the igneous rocks. You can tell have what I'd call a concave shape in them, like it's been dug out with a shovel. And what I discovered is that if you look in that concave shape, which means you're basically looking at a chip from the rock, you're looking inside the hole that remains that chip, you'll see some of these little micro gemstones in there, and it's very consistent. I was really surprised to find it very consistent as I went from one of these rocks to the other. Let me get that a little bit closer in focus. Now we're dealing with but you can see, so right there is the edge of the crater, for lack of a better way to describe it. And you can see some gemstones on the edge of the crater right here. But as you go deeper into the crater of this sandstone, you'll see there are progressively more clusters of these little gems. And that's what these are right here. Now once I find a better example of this, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go to 10x and we'll take a closer look at them. So I think this is one we could do. So right there, you can see a couple of these micro gemstones, a red one and an orange one right in there. But I want to find, it was just so consistent. I want to see if I can find one of the ones that has a crater in it, like this one. Let me see if that one has any. Because it wasn't true for all of them. No, that's not a crater. Let's see. You got a question?
Tony Rusi wants to know, do you have any sand samples with gold flakes in them?
Not yet, but we may, we can expect to see them, especially when we start doing more and more rivers.
There was another question about gold up here.
Okay.
Let's see. What is the black sand often found with gold when panning?
They call it black sand, but it's iron magnetite. And it's heavy. It's not as heavy as gold, but that's why it ends up at the bottom of the pan. So there's one with an orange crystal on top, followed by a red one. That could very well be a ruby or a garnet. But as you can see, once you see some of these stones up close, they have a lot of these little micro gems in them. I do want to find one of the clusters that I discovered. Maybe that one there. Okay, so let's see if I can find it. So there's the edge of the crater right there. But as you go down deeper into the crater, you'll see that it has these little tiny clusters of gemstones, micro gemstones in them. And they are, the closer you get to them. What I'm trying to do is find one that I can zoom in 10x with so you can see them. But I need to find one that's pretty well developed because the 10x is very short depth of field. Let's see if that one's right there. That might be one. So there's some gemstones on top of that one. So I'm going to go to 10x and give me a second to focus here so that you can see them just a little bit better. So as you go down into the crater, you'll see the little miniature gemstones of various colors, orange and yellow and red. And that's consistent. I mean, there's a lot of consistency to that. So I'm going to go back to the 5x. And let's take a look at, let me see if I can find a piece of quartz. The quartz really stand out because they're not only getting the polarized light, but they're refracting back the polarized light to the viewers. So it's got a very colorful look to that. As you can see, that's a piece of quartz. And and that's the combination of the polarized light shining upon it and then being reflected back into the microscope. So it's got a real pretty look to it. So there weren't many bigger pieces. The quartz were pretty limited in size, but they too, if you look at them carefully, the quartz will have the smaller gemstones embedded in them like this one does. This one has I'll call it citrine because that's what it looks like to me, the orange gemstone in it. But the polarized light gives it a completely different look. It's got that sparkle to it that, makes it look almost alive. There's a bigger piece of quartz that's what I'd call semi-translucent. And as you can see, you have to work your way through it from the top to the bottom because the depth of field is so small. So you start at the top, and what I'm basically doing, working my way to the bottom. You actually, that's how you make photographs, complete photographs of them. The other thing that I noticed is that there were some of the quartz that would actually reflect the light so brightly, you can see it puts a halo around it on the petri dish behind it, and this was one of them. So I'll come back and make some photos of these later, and I'll add them to our album, our photo album. Okay, so a very different look at sand from a river. And it looks like a relatively young batch of sand because the more you look at them, the more you see, especially on the ones that look like they're rocks, like they're igneous rocks. They're not as refined. They have sharp edges. And that means they haven't been tumbled as much as the others. Even some of these quartz that we've seen have sharp edges. Now, the difference is quartz is much harder on the Mohs scale than most of the minerals in these rocks. So it stays that way, and that's one of the reasons quartz survives all the way to end up on beaches in various locations on the world because it is a very hard mineral. Okay, anything else? Questions?
No, just chit chat.
Okay. Okay, all right, guys.
They did talk about they've been there. Hooley's been there, and Tony Russi's talking about She Who Watches is a very famous petroglyph near there. It looks like a bear. They keep the location hidden now because of vandalism, but they have weekly guided tours to it.
Yeah. So, Tony, you mentioned the nano petroglyphs. It's funny because there are sometimes you can look into a quartz sample under the microscope. And the other day I saw a Native American woman looking through the quartz right at me because it was just shaped. It was just the colors, of the rocks. And
so Corey Jacobs said, I still half expect something to be peering back at Toby and Shelley one of these times. So I guess he was right.
Yeah, there are times when, to me, it looks like that way, like something. You see a lot of skulls. There seems to be a lot of skulls in the quartz. But again, that's probably just my imagination running wild. All right, guys, thanks for joining us today. And again, thank you to Lisa Smith for having sent us these samples. She was very helpful getting the two samples, one from the Washington side of the river, one from the Oregon side of the river. We've added it to our collection. We've created an album for it, and I'll put a link to that album in the description box below so you can take a look at it. Tell your friends. Oh, I didn't go through I'll do some post show.
I'm skipping you one time.
Make sure that if you liked what you saw today, you share this with your family, your friends, your neighbors, your business associates, and the entirety of your social network so that we can
grow the channel.
That's right, grow the channel. So we want you to like it, share it. Share it. Like our video, YouTube likes it. Oh, and subscribe. If you're not already a subscriber, this would be the ideal time to subscribe because this is what we think of as our educational channel. And you're going to learn more, not only about sand, but about the shortage of sand. And you're going to learn about geology. And you're going to learn about the surface of the earth. And you're going to learn about foraminifera. And so there's all kinds of things to be learned. I do want you to come on Friday because the sample that I have for Friday is I'm going to say short of the sample that we got last week from Delray Beach, which had our first organics in it. This sample comes from Pfeiffer Beach on Big Sur in California, which is kind of south of Monterey, which is where I went to language school back in the day. And it's just beautiful. It really does look like rubies and diamonds and amethyst, the sand. And I can explain to you, I've figured out why. And I can explain to you where the sand comes from because it's just knockout. It's beautiful. So make sure you join us on Friday because it's going to be some very nice images of that particular sand from Pfeiffer Beach. Okay? Thanks for joining us today. Oops. Wrong one.
Thanks for joining us on the World Sand Project. Next up, the softer side on thesofterside.live. We'll be talking about the coming new decade, so be there.
How to prepare for the coming new decade?
That's right.
Is there anything I should know?
All kinds of things.
Oh, great. All right.
Be there.
Be there, be square. All right, thanks for joining us today. Join us later, 4 o'clock Mountain Standard Time for the Softer Side at thesofterside.live. Join us at 7 o'clock for a Gypsy's Kiss at gypsieskiss.tv because it's the same two of us.
Yeah.
You might get bored, but we have a good time. And one of Shelley's viewers last week was surprised at how much I didn't talk on the Softer Side. So there's an added benefit. You don't have to listen to me talk on the Softer Side.
Promises.
Yeah. All right, here we go. Thanks, guys.